So welcome to this meeting and this session on Introduction to C#9, the new language features that Microsoft has introduced in the .NET Framework 5. Before we dive into it, I would like to take a chance to introduce myself. My name is Menno Jongerius. I've been working as a lead developer and also as the captain of the lead developers at Bergla Software Solution. I've been working with Microsoft technology for, I guess, a little bit over 20 years now. And I really believe in the power of sessions like this because it gives us a chance as software developers to share knowledge, to share experience. And I really believe that that helps us to become better software developers. So let's dive into it and have a look at the background info on C#9. So as I said before, C#9 is coming and is featured in the .NET 5 language or .NET 5 framework. This is actually the first time because it's basically a new version of .NET Core, but it's the first time without the core. And the reason for that is very simple. Microsoft is not releasing any new versions of .NET Framework. So it means that for them, the future is .NET Core, or at least the multi-platform environment of .NET. And I guess this is important because it also means that as developers, we need to come up with some kind of migration strategy to move away from .NET Framework somewhere in the future and go towards the .NET 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or whatever version we're at that moment. The language version is always linked to the .NET version. You can deviate from that, but it's not supported. I will show you how to do that later on because most of you will probably not have switched to .NET 5 yet. But just hang on in there. It will show you what Microsoft is going to do and what they're moving towards. And even on older code bases, you could decide to start using it. I will show you how and just put some disclaimers there. So another thing to keep in mind is that .NET 5 is a general availability version. And this basically means that if you look at the schedule for .NET from Microsoft, that every even number will be long-term support version. So that will be .NET 6, .NET 8, and .NET 10 after that. And the uneven versions or the uneven numbers will be general availability. What this means is that you will not see full support of those versions, for example, if you go to Azure Functions or other places where Microsoft implements given versions of the framework. Azure Functions, for example, at the moment is still focused on .NET Core 3.1. So definitely something to keep in mind. Of course, .NET 6 is around the corner. It's expected in November of this year, so we don't have to wait too long for that, but keep this in mind. Now, with .NET 5 and C#9, we have a lot of additions to the language that are being released. I will not go into all of them because there is a big risk that you will either go to another session or fall asleep, and none of those things is really what I'm aiming for. So I just picked three to have a closer look at. And one is the init setters and the record type. This is actually really a new feature in the language, and it's really cool because it's an attempt to breach the gap between you have the value types on the one hand, so the structs basically, and then you have the reference types, the classes on the other hand. And you could make a class that behaves like a value type, but you would have to write a lot of code for that. I will also describe what the use case is because especially with the domain-driven design that's coming up nowadays that actually has a value type, which should be immutable, this is a really powerful addition to the language. Now, the other thing we're going to have a look at is target typing. And the third thing we're going to have a look at is pattern matching. I'm not going to do them in that order. I'm just going to start with pattern matching. So let's dive into the code because the best way to see this is just in code. In order to experiment with this, create a class library in .NET Core or any type of project for that matter in .NET Core. I will create one here. Name is not important for this moment. Now, it's good to realize that if you create a class library or any project in .NET Core, at the moment, it will by default use the long-term support version. So this is basically the version 3.1. which doesn't by default support C#9. So first of all, I'm going to switch to the 5.0 version of the language, or of the framework, sorry. And we'll just have a look at the pattern matching. So first of all, let's grab ourselves an object so that we have something to work with. For example, a person. Nothing fancy here, just an object with a couple of properties. And let's first have a look at some changes or addition in the language. So for example, in C#8 and before, if you wanted to do some simple checks, like for example, is an age not between 12 and 60, it's a little bit of a bogus piece of code, but it's just to explain something to you. You could see something like this. Now, this is quite fine, but it's, I guess, sometimes hard to read because of all these characters and stuff like that. In the new C#9 version, you have the ability to actually write this in a different way using new keywords. So for example, is not would just be is not 0. And then you could say and is smaller than 12 or is larger than 60. So for one, you don't have to repeat the keyword age because it knows that you're doing something with age. And this is not really extremely new in the sense that I think in the link, so if you used link or lambda expressions, that you could already do stuff like this. But it's kind of new that they added it to the normal language, so to speak. And I do believe it increases readability. I think, you know, I come from a time when we were using still Visual Basic a lot, or Basic even before that. I guess that, you know, some people have a slight allergy towards using it this way, but I personally believe that it does increase readability in some cases. So it's definitely a cool feature to have. Now, the other one is about pattern matching. In the C#8 versions, you probably would be able to do something like this. If you wanted to switch on the age of a person, for example. Now, as you can see, this is not really increasing readability. It becomes kind of bulky and you have a lot of repetition in the code. It is possible in C#9 to actually use a shorthand for this and just do the switch immediately on the property. I'm not really sure if it increases readability, by the way, but I'll let you decide. But you could do something like this and just say, I want to do a switch on the age of a person. If it's smaller than 12, I return 5 if it's between 12 and 60. And you also see those keywords coming up here. You actually have to use them. You cannot just say this. It will usually give you errors. So you actually have to use the keywords, but you can say if it's between 12 and 60, and if it's bigger than 60, do this. So this is kind of cool. It's really compact. Then another thing they added is some pattern matching on object comparisons. This is also not completely new, but the addition of being able to actually match on property is new. So you have an object. If the object is a person and the age is smaller than 20, return true. So you can make some nice combinations of properties and matching on the type. Which can be really helpful. Otherwise, you probably need to write several if statements for that. Now you can do that at once. There is a slight disclaimer to that, though, because it does change behavior. I will show you with another example of code. So if you look at this, for example, normally, probably in the past, you would have checked for the length of any array by, for instance, using array length. You could change that and you could say, okay, I'm going to use pattern matching and I'm going to say if this array of arguments is having a property length that is bigger than 0. Now this works. The only problem is it doesn't have the exact same behavior in the sense that in the example here below, if the argument statement would be a null, it would actually throw an error. In the statement above, because you're using pattern matching, it will just say the pattern doesn't match, but it will not throw an error. Now, of course, it depends on whether your code depends on that error, but if you expect an error there and you actually do something with it, maybe some kind of error handling, then it is important to realize that the behavior of the code might change, and you might get some unexpected things going on if you don't account for that. Now you can go all crazy with this. I will actually show you an example of some more advanced stuff going on with pattern matching. So simple pattern matching on types, quite straightforward. You can say if it's any object but not of the ones that we had up here, then do this. If it's null, do that. And you can go kind of crazy and create a switch statement that is basically an entire method with a lot of logic in it. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because personally, I don't really like if there is a lot of logic inside of my method or inside of my switch. I would rather use a method for that. But the fact that it's possible and you can go this far is kind of cool. Okay, so the next feature to have a look at is the target typing. Now, target typing is not a word that you probably use a lot because I do use a feature, but I never really realized that it was called target typing until I started preparing for this C#9 presentation. But it is actually something that we use quite a lot, and they made some rather nice improvements to it, I might say. So let's dive into the code and have a look at what the target typing is actually doing. So again, let's have a method, public void example. And you're probably used to something like this. If you say var person is new person. And the compiler will know that this is a person because you actually declared a person here. You don't have to explicitly declare it. You can just use the var keyword. Now, some teams are allergic to the var keyword. I personally like it because of the alignment of all of the names that you have over here. In the new C#9 version, you can also write it like this and say, I have a person, but I don't have to define it on the right hand of this thing. Of course, I need to say this is person 2 because otherwise I have 2 definitions of person, but you can also write it like this. Now you might say, what is the profit of this? Because I already have this construction with the var, so why does this benefit me? Well, not so much in here, but it does benefit you in the sense that you cannot use this var statement outside of a method. So on top here, if you had a private person, then you would say, I declare it as a new person, for example. And now you get this duplication of, oh, it's a person. Yeah, it's a person. You can now just leave that second thing behind. And this is kind of nice because now you get more compact code. And I will actually show you an example in the presentation because I added an example here where you can see with this observable collection of person, and then you get this new observable collection of person, and then you have, for example, here also person, add new person. This just all becomes a lot of text just to explain that you want to get something, but you already know what you need. So in this case, this is actually the new code, which would be much more compact. You just have an observable collection of person. You can say, give me a new instance of it. I already know what it is, so don't declare it again. And also here, add a person, just say new, because it already knows that a person is expected here, so you don't have to define it again. And then it becomes kind of cool because those are features that you didn't have with the var keyword that you do have right now. So that's really nice. Now there is one other benefit of, that Microsoft was a bit smarter about the way they define targets, and that has to do with when you, for example, have a function like this. Now this would actually give you an exception in the old language version. And the reason it gave an exception is because you define that the return type of this method is an IEnumerable, and then you use a construction like this but then Microsoft says the left and the right side need to be identical types. And this is not identical because this is a list and this is an array. But they both implement IEnumerable, or they both confirm to the IEnumerable interface. Well, because of the new target typing, Microsoft will say, if I know that you're returning an IEnumerable, then I really don't care that these two types are different as long as they implement IEnumerable. And there are quite a few examples of this issue that are being solved by this. I think you probably have um, some examples in mind of your own code where you needed to cast an object where you thought, well, this doesn't make sense. The object actually implements the interface that I tried to return, but I cannot use it because of the construction in the code. So that issue is solved with the new C#9 version. Now let's dive into the record and init only properties. And these are really cool new features, because especially if you are a fan of domain-driven design and you're creating these modular software modules that use this the domain-driven design approach, you will be familiar with value types. And the whole idea is that they are immutable. But also, if you are more of a traditional multi-layer approach, then you probably have used data transfer objects in the past that you most likely also wanted to have immutable, but to make them immutable is kind of a problem because, for example, if you really make them immutable, the serialization became an issue or other stuff became an issue. So that wasn't really a nice thing to do. Now with the new init keyword and also with the new record type, we actually have quite an improvement here for the developer. So let's just show you, based again on this example that we have right here. So normally what I would do if I would like to make immutable properties, I would probably do something like this. Make all the setters private. We'll just do that and create a constructor that actually sets those values. So then you have something like first name and last name and age. I will not finish all the code because it's not about you watching me type, but this is basically what you could do. And you could say var person is new person, and then you could use this constructor. Now, of course, if there are a lot of properties, it becomes kind of a problem because you have to write these huge constructors. It's even more tricky if you have optional stuff, like how do you deal with that? I still don't want them to be mutable, but the only way I can put them into the method is putting them in the constructor. What I'm going to do, I'm going to pass a null value then. That doesn't really, that's not nice to read. So all sorts of issues that you have if you do this. Last but not least, I mean, these private setters can give you real headaches when it comes to serialization frameworks. If you use, if you want to serialize to JSON or if you want to serialize to XML, then you know it will say this is a private setter. I cannot deserialize this this object or serialize it or whatever. So all sorts of issues, and most of the time teams would just say, forget about it. I'm just going to make this a public setter. Now, of course, that's a bit of an issue. So in comes the new keyword of init as a, of course, you cannot make a public setter like that, but never mind. The new keyword of init, and this is really a cool feature. So if you use this like this, it's not actually going into the constructor. I will show you how it works. So you're not getting it in the constructor, but what you can do now is you can say, I have a new person, and then you can just use this type of initialization, which you're probably already familiar with, and set the properties. I'm 43, don't tell anyone. Oh, it does help if you actually put the right name there. Now, what is the cool thing about this is if you set them initially and you want to change them later on, you can't. It will give you an error. So it will say, look, it's nice that you want to do this, but you can't do this. This is an init only property. So I now have by default immutability. And the way this works is not actually by making this a private property. It is a public setter, but it's using synthetic sugar that the compiler knows if this is the case, if this is an init property, don't allow me to change it. I could still change it if I use reflection. That's actually a good thing because it means that this code and this class will work with all known serialization platforms, because those platforms don't care. They just, you know, they just go through the properties and they do whatever they need to do. And they can, because this is only affecting the compiler that, you know, basically the IntelliSense. So that's really cool. Now, what about record types? So record is basically another extension to this idea. I can change this type class into a type record. And what will happen is that Microsoft will add another couple of really cool features. Most importantly, that records actually compare based on value type, or based on values, sorry. So if I have a person and I say this is a new person with a first name, for example, of Menno, and then let's say that I have a second person that also have the first name Menno. Now, normally what would happen is if I say var result is person equal to person 2, then the compiler would say, or the code would say, no, this result is false, because these are two reference types and they're actually two different objects, even though the values are the same. What Microsoft introduced with the record type is that they are indeed the same, because it's using a value comparison. And the way it's doing that is that it's implementing IEquatable, it's overriding the hash code. So it's doing a lot of additional code that you get 100% for free. You don't have to do anything about it. And you could even use some shorthand as well, because here I just wrote the entire object, but I could even say, I don't care about this object. I want to have a string first name, I want to have a string last name, and I want to have an int age. And if I write it like this, I do need to use a constructor in this case. I can actually use this object with a constructor. And again, create the second version of it. And I have a really cool shorthand to write this record type. And these actually become properties. So I can just say, okay, but this person, what kind of properties does it have? Oh, it has age, it has first name, it has last name, which is also, by the way, why I write them with capital letters, even though normally you wouldn't do that there, but because it basically creates the code that gives them these properties. And I cannot change them because they are immutable. So this is a really nice way of very, very quickly being able to create data objects. So either data transfer objects, or maybe, you know, value types that go into your domain-driven design approach. It's really, really cool to be able to do this. So as a summary, records are reference types. So they're just classes. They have all the similar characteristics of classes when it comes to memory usage or whatever, but they behave like value types. Well, kind of anyway. They're not identical to structs, and they are fancy classes in the sense that Microsoft is writing all the code for you that you would normally have to write to get this type of behavior. A record by default overrides to string. I will show you that in a minute when I show you how you can support these language features in older versions of .NET. And also they implement IEquality and override the get hash code. So by definition, you get a value comparison instead of a reference comparison, which is really cool for these type of objects. Now, when can you use this? Basically everywhere where you want to have a value object. So meaning you want to have, for example, a data transfer object or a value type in domain-driven design. And the nice thing is, I believe this communicates much, much better to other developers what your purpose was with this object. So because it's immutable, everybody will understand I'm not supposed to touch the features or the properties of this object. If you want to, you can. Actually, I can show you in code. So if I really want to make a change, which normally you wouldn't do, you can only do that by making a copy. So I could say I have a third person, for example, which is a copy of the first person with a change in one of the properties. So I can change the first name and I can change it to Aryan, for example. Now, this may look like why do you need to do that? Well, because they are immutable. So if I want to make a change, I can only do that by creating a copy of the original and then using that as a reference point. Yeah, which is kind of cool. They're not suitable for describing any type of entity or any type of class that depends on, for example, change tracking or stuff like that. So if you think about using this with Entity Framework, don't forget about it. You cannot do it there. So, but probably it's not a good idea to have your entities running through your whole code base anyway, and you want to really encapsulate them in some kind of repository idea, a layer or whatever. Most of the products that I see use some kind of multi-layering with data transfer objects anyway. So, but should you think of that, it won't work. Now there is some documentation on this. Microsoft has already finished all the documentation on C#9, so that's really cool to have a look at. But of course, last but not least, what if I'm using an older version of .NET and I want to use these cool new features? It is possible. It is not officially supported, so have a little bit of caution when you start doing this. But because most of these language features are actually compiler sugar, you can use them. And the way to do that, and actually I used a console application here in .NET Framework 4.8, which is probably as far off as you want to go, because it's, you know, it's really focused on .NET Core 3.1 or .NET Standard 2.1 or something like that. But you can just add the language version to the project file and it will switch to the new language. For most of the features that will work out of the box, but in some cases, especially with the init and the record type, you actually need to do a little bit more. And I will show you, and that's also a bit why I say have some caution here, because it feels like a hack and it probably is a hack. Because by default, if you try to use it, you will actually get some errors. And the reason you get errors is because the new record type and init keyword depend on a couple of attributes that are not available in .NET Framework 4.8, for example. Now, the good news is that since Microsoft is open sourcing everything, you can actually enable them by simply putting the code in place like this. Let me first do it properly. And like this. So there are a couple of attributes that you need. And then you can actually use the new keywords and the program will just work. So I have, for example, two record types here, a person and a contact. And I can also show you how the right line works, because the toString I said was also overwritten by default. It will not give you the namespace of the object, but it will actually give you all the values, which is also kind of cool. So let's just show that. And you can see that it's actually writing the values of the objects instead of the namespace or the type which you would usually get. Now, should you do this? Well, handle with caution. I might do it if I have some kind of modular approach with domain-driven design already in place and I really want to use this record type. I might be tempted to do it, but you know, I'm also not really recommending it because it's not officially supported by Microsoft. So just investigate it. I don't expect anything to break because it's just compiler sugar, most of it. And the code that you will get at the end, the compiled code will be pretty much the same. So I don't expect any issues there, but still. So all that remains is time for questions. I hope you enjoyed this talk, that you got some new ideas, that you got some inspiration for what's going on in the Microsoft landscape when it comes to the language features. And I wish you a lot of fun at this conference and a lot of nice talks, and hopefully you get a lot of inspiration. But first, let's have some questions.